Sherlock Holmes and the case of the family that died laughing, an original mystery in the tradition of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as narrated by Dr. John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1. The Grotesque Inheritance of Wycliffe Hall. The autumn of 1895 was, by any measure, an unremarkable season in London. Fogs came early, the streets ran slick with November drizzle, and the newspapers were filled with the usual catalogue of parliamentary disputes and colonial anxieties. I had returned to Baker Street some months prior, following a professional matter that had drawn me to the continent, and had settled once again into the comfortable domestic rhythms of that singular household. Holmes playing his violin at ungodly hours, conducting chemical experiments that fouled the air for days, and I reading by the fire, grateful, I confess, for the irregular excitement that his company inevitably produced. It was on a Thursday morning, the 7th of November, that the matter of the Wycliffe family was first brought to our attention. I remember the precise date because I had been meaning to pay a visit to an old regimental friend whose birthday fell on that day, and the arrival of Inspector Gideon Marrable of Scotland Yard put an end to that intention entirely. Holmes was in an irritable temper. He had been between cases for 11 days. A drought that he described, with characteristic drama, the intellectual equivalent of suffocation, and had spent the previous evening firing an old revolver at the sitting-room wall in a pattern I could not discern but which he insisted formed a rather complete map of boredom. Mrs. Hudson had been stoic, as always, though I noticed she had taken to padding about in reinforced slippers. Inspector Marrable was a compact, methodical man of perhaps 45, with a neatly trimmed moustache, and the permanently worried expression of someone who suspects the world. Is conspiring to perplex him. He had worked with Holmes on 2 previous occasions, the matter of the Whitechapel forgeries and the disappearance of the alderman's seal, and, though he nursed, I believe, a quiet, he was sensible enough to seek assistance when a case exceeded his considerable competence. He entered our sitting-room at 9:30, refused tea with the air of a man who had already consumed more than was advisable, placed upon our table a leather satchel, from which he extracted a folder of papers, 2 photographs, and a coroner's preliminary report. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have this morning attended a scene the like of which I have not encountered in 22 years of police work. 3 members of the Wycliffe family, Sir Edmund Wycliffe, his wife Lady Constance, and his brother Mr. Phineas Wycliffe, were found dead in the dining-room of Wycliffe Hall, in the village of Crestwood, Surrey, early yesterday morning. Family's housekeeper, a Mrs. Agnes Tolliver, discovered them when she arrived to lay the breakfast table. Holmes, who had been sprawled across his chair with an expression of studied indifference, straightened almost imperceptibly. "And the cause of death?" he asked. "That," said Marrable, "is precisely the problem. The preliminary coroner's report suggests cardiac arrest in all 3 cases, but there is no evidence of poison in the food or drink, no signs of struggle, no external marks of violence. The doors were locked from within, the windows were latched, and the detail," Holmes said softly, his grey eye sharpening to a quality that always reminded me of the moment before, lightning, "that you have not yet mentioned." Marrable paused. He looked at Holmes with an expression caught between irritation and reluctant admiration. "You've already heard?" "I have heard nothing. But you have not told me the most important fact, Inspector, because you are uncertain how to phrase it without sounding absurd. Your left hand has been pressing the table's edge since you began speaking, a gesture that suggests you are bracing yourself for ridicule. There is something about this scene that you expect a rational man to dismiss. Tell me, without embarrassment, what you found." Marrable cleared his throat. "All 3 of them," he said carefully, found with expressions of extreme amusement on their faces, mouths open, eyes crinkled. The housekeeper described it as, and this is her word, not mine. She said they looked as though they had died laughing. The room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage rattled past on Baker Street, and somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was scolding the boy who delivered coal. Holmes pressed his fingertips together and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has just been offered a particularly elegant chess problem. "Extraordinary," he murmured. Quite extraordinary, Watson. Your coat. We are going to Surrey." I had travelled many roads in Holmes's company, from the fog-choked lanes of rural England to the gleaming corridors of London's great institutions, but the road to Crestwood that November morning had a peculiar quality to it. As if the landscape itself had gone slightly wrong, the fields were grey and waterlogged, the trees stripped bare, and the village of Crestwood, when we reached it at noon, had the subdued, watchful quality of a community that has received bad news and does not yet know what to do with it. Wycliffe Hall stood at the northern edge of the village, behind a screen of old oaks that in summer would have been magnificent and in November skeletal and admonitory. It was a house of moderate grandeur, Georgian in its bones but much modified, additions that spoke of different eras and different tastes, none of them entirely harmonious. The grounds were well kept, the gravel raked, the hedges trimmed. Someone had taken pride in this place. A constable stood at the iron gate. 2 others were visible near the front entrance. The village doctor, Dr. Silas Fenwick, had been summoned and waited in the entrance hall with the defensive air of a man whose professional opinion been implicitly questioned. He was a portly individual of perhaps 60, with a ruddy face and a manner that oscillated between dignity and anxiety. "The bodies have been moved to the back parlour," he told us. I thought it improper to leave them at the table. Holmes turned to him with the full force of his attention, and I watched the doctor instinctively straighten. "You examined them on sight before they were moved?" "I did. And your assessment of the expressions, the post-mortem appearance?" Dr. Fenwick hesitated. "Rhizus sardonicus," he said at last. "Phenomenons, sometimes associated with tetanus or strychnine poisoning. But I found no evidence of either in my preliminary examination. Gastric contents. What I could determine without a full toxicological analysis appeared unremarkable." "Rhizus sardonicus," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "The sardonic grin, yes. And yet none of the classical symptoms of strychnine, the muscular rigidity, pisthetonus. None that I observed clearly, though the postures were unusual. Unusual how?" Fenwick seemed to weigh his words, relaxed, almost comfortable, as if they had simply ceased in the middle of a pleasant evening. Holmes nodded once, then turned toward the dining-room door. Chapter 2. The dining-room of 3 deaths. The dining-room of Wycliffe Hall was a long, panelled chamber, hung with ancestral portraits, whose subjects stared down at us with the imperturbable severity of the long dead. The table was laid for a dinner that had apparently been completed. Plates cleared away but not washed, crystal glasses still bearing the residue of wine, a centrepiece of dried autumn flowers arranged in a silver vase. 3 chairs sat at irregular angles from the table's near end, as if their occupants had pushed back from conversation, not catastrophe. Holmes moved into the room the way a man moves into a room when he believes the room itself is speaking to him. He did not rush. He stood near the door for a long moment, simply looking, his eyes moving with that methodical, unhurried precision that I had learned, over years, to recognize as his highest concentration. "The chairs," he said. "Watson, note the positions. I noted them in my book. 3 chairs were angled in a rough triangle around one end of the table, not the head, which was at the far end, but closer to the middle. It suggested an intimate gathering, a pulling together, rather than a formal dinner with each person at their appointed station. They moved the chairs themselves, I said.
To sit closer.
Correct. This was not a formal dinner. It was a private conversation between three people who wished to speak freely, and did not want the length of the table between them. Note also, Holmes crouched and examined the floor with his glass. The small scuff marks near the foot of the central chair, repeated, rhythmic. Someone was tapping their foot. Nervous, or merely habitual. He rose and went to the fireplace, which was large, iron-grated, and cold now, but which bore the marks of a recent fire. Ash still soft and grey, not yet compacted. He knelt and examined it with his lens. Paper was burned here recently. Not a log, a document. See the pattern of the ash? Too uniform, too flat. Someone burned papers in this fireplace, and they did so with some thoroughness. At least 3 or 4 pages. Last night? Marrable asked from the doorway. The ash is still loose. Pff, not more than 12 hours, I should think. Possibly during or immediately after dinner. Holmes stood, dusted his knees, and went to the wine glasses. He lifted each in turn, sniffing carefully, then held them to the light from the tall windows. The wine is a Bordeaux, mid-range. The Wycliffes were not extravagant drinkers, or at any rate not on this evening. All 3 glasses are roughly equally depleted, no residue beyond what the wine itself would leave. He set them down with evident thought, and yet the glasses are interesting for what they tell us about the mood. Each person drank at a similar rate. No one abstained. No one drank excessively. They were at ease. I had been examining the plates which had been stacked on the sideboard. The meal had been simple. Roast chicken, potatoes, greens. A second course had apparently been taken, as there were dessert dishes as well, bearing the faint ghost of what looked like a fruit pudding. A complete dinner, I observed. 3 courses. Finished. Whatever happened to them, it happened after a perfectly normal meal. Or during, Holmes said. He went to the door and called for Mrs. Tolliver. Agnes Tolliver was a woman in her late 50s, iron-spined and red-eyed, composure. The kind that comes not from the absence of grief, but from its rigid suppression. She had served the Wycliffe household for 19 years, she told us, and spoke of Sir Edmund and Lady Constance with a restrained warmth that told me she had genuinely respected them. What was the nature of the dinner? Holmes asked her. Did you cook it yourself? I did, sir. Roast chicken, as was Sir Edmund's preference on a Wednesday. Potatoes and wintergreens, and a plum pudding that had been set 2 days prior. Did you serve the meal? I served the first course and set the second and third courses on the sideboard, as I always do when Sir Edmund wished privacy. He preferred to serve himself and his guests at such dinners without interruption. Such dinners, Holmes repeated. This was not, then, an ordinary Wednesday supper? Mrs. Tolliver hesitated. No, sir. There was a feeling of preparation about it. Sir Edmund had been in correspondence with his solicitor the day before, and with his brother Mr. Phineas, who was visiting from Bath. He told me that they would be having a private family discussion, and that I should leave the dishes and retire. And you did so. At 9 o'clock, sir. I heard them still talking as I went upstairs. I sleep in the east wing, in the servants' rooms. I heard nothing further until morning. When you found them, describe exactly what you saw. The housekeeper's composure flickered. They were in their chairs, sir, all 3. Sir Edmund at the centre, Lady Constance to his right, Mr. Phineas to his left. They looked. She stopped, steadied herself. They looked as though something had surprised them, pleasantly, sir. Sir Edmund's head was thrown slightly back. Mr. Phineas was leaning toward Lady Constance as if he'd been telling her something. She. Her voice dropped. She had her hand on the table, as if she'd been about to reach for something. And they were all smiling with their whole faces. She could not continue for a moment. When she recovered herself, she added quietly, "I have never seen Sir Edmund smile quite like that in 19 years. Chapter 3. The Survivors and Their Secrets, the Wycliffe family, it emerged over the course of that afternoon, was not without its tensions. Holmes and I spent 2 hours conducting interviews with those who had been connected to the household, and with each conversation the portrait grew more complex and, I felt, more troubling. The first to speak with us was Mr. Reginald Wycliffe, Sir Edmund's eldest son, who had arrived from London that morning upon receiving the news. He was a man of 34, angular and fair-haired, the permanently slightly offended expression of a person who has expected more from life than life has delivered. He sat in the library with his hands on his knees and answered our questions with a clipped precision that suggested controlled agitation rather than grief. My father was in good health, he said. He had a heart condition, had done for years, but it was managed. His physician in Guildford, Dr. Hargreaves, had seen him only a fortnight ago and declared him stable. "And your uncle, Mr. Phineas Wycliffe?" Holmes asked. A flicker. My uncle was a complicated individual. He and my father had an arrangement regarding the family trust that had been a source of friction for some years. What sort of arrangement? Reginald Wycliffe straightened slightly. The Wycliffe estate, the hall, the investments, the income from several properties, is held in a trust established by my grandfather. Under its terms, income was divided equally between my father and his brother. But the hall and its principal assets were to pass entirely to the eldest son of the senior line, which is to say to me upon my father's death. And Mr. Phineas objected to this arrangement. He had always objected. My uncle had a particular talent for spending money and a particular distaste for earning it. He was convinced the trust was unjust. He had spent the last 3 years in consultation with solicitors attempting to challenge it. A pause. I believe that was the purpose of last night's dinner. My father had received a legal opinion. I don't know its contents, and he intended to discuss the matter with my uncle and mother together. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Your mother was not party to the trust dispute in any legal sense. No, but my father confided in her completely. She would have been there as a witness and a support. And where were you, Mr. Wycliffe, yesterday evening? Man met Holmes's gaze without flinching, but the controlled agitation intensified briefly behind his eyes. I was in London, my club, the Athenaeum, from 6 until 10, at which point I returned to my flat in Kensington. My man can confirm it. He will be asked, Holmes said pleasantly. Thank you. The second conversation was with Miss Dorothea Wycliffe, Sir Edmund's younger daughter, 26, and had been living at the Hall until 3 months prior, when she had taken rooms in Guildford with a friend to pursue painting. She was dark-haired, intelligent-eyed, and had been weeping, though she had stopped by the time she spoke with us, and approached the conversation with a directness that I found admirable. You should know, she said immediately, that Uncle Phineas was not a good man. I say that not to speak ill of the dead, but because it is relevant to understanding the household. How so? Holmes asked. He had debts, extensive ones. Gambling, I believe, though he denied it. He had borrowed money from my father on 3 separate occasions in the past 5 years, and repaid none of it. Father was patient, but there was a limit. I believe last night's dinner was about the trust. Yes, but also about Uncle Phineas being told that there would be no further personal loans. You knew this? Father told me when I last visited, a month ago. He was sad about it. He loved his brother, I think, in the way one loves a person who persistently disappoints you. He had reached a decision. And you were not present last night? No. I was in Guildford. I can give you the address. She gave it. I learned of it this morning by telegram. Holmes studied her. Miss Wycliffe, in your time living at the Hall, did you ever observe anything that struck you as unusual? Any visitors, any behaviours, any changes in the household in the recent months? She thought carefully. There was a man, she said at last, who visited the Hall twice in October. I saw him from my window. I was staying for the weekend both times. He arrived in the afternoon, spoke with father in the study, and left within the hour. I never learned his name. Father mentioned him only as a business matter. He was not the sort of man one usually associates with business. He was younger than father's usual visitors, early 40s perhaps, very well dressed. Dark complexion. He walked with a slight limp in his right leg. Holmes's expression gave away nothing, but I saw his eyes intensify fractionally. You are an observant woman, he said simply. I am a painter, she said. I look at people. The third interview was the most revealing, though not in ways we could fully understand at the time. The family solicitor, Mr. Cornelius Bray, had been summoned from Guildford by Marrable, and arrived at Wycliffe Hall at 4 in the afternoon, flustered and formal in equal measure. He was a small, precise man of 60, with gold-framed spectacles and the careful manner of a person accustomed to navigating between competing interests. He confirmed that he had met with Sir Edmund 2 days previously. He confirmed that a legal opinion had been prepared and delivered regarding the family trust. But when Holmes pressed him on the contents of that opinion, he retreated behind the shield of client confidentiality with practised efficiency. Sir Edmund is deceased, Holmes observed. And his estate and its interests continue, Bray replied. I shall of course engage with the appropriate legal representative of the estate in due course. Was the opinion favourable to Sir Edmund's position or to his brother's? A long pause. Bray's eyes moved to the window. I can say only that it was conclusive. And which party did it conclude in favour of? Another pause. It substantially upheld the terms of the original trust. Holmes nodded slowly. Meaning Mr. Phineas Wycliffe had exhausted his legal options. Bray said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. Chapter 4. Holmes reflects and Watson wonders. We dined that night at the Crestwood Arms, public house of modest ambition but sound cooking, and Holmes ate with better appetite than I had seen him display in weeks, which was always a sign that he was stimulated. He said very little during the meal itself, and I had learned not to press him at such moments. His mind was evidently at work on something, and the best service I could render was to let it work. It was after dinner, when we had taken our pipes to a pair of chairs near the public house fire, and the tap-room had quieted around us, that he finally spoke. 3 deaths, he said. 3 apparently natural cardiac events occurring simultaneously, or nearly so. 3 healthy or moderately healthy individuals after a shared meal. No obvious poison in the food, no signs of violence, locked room, that expression. The rhizus sardonicus, I said, which is associated, as Fenwick correctly identified, with certain alkaloid compounds, strychnine being the classical candidate. But strychnine produces severe muscular convulsions and extreme rigidity, symptoms that would be unmistakable and that were entirely absent here. The bodies were, by all accounts, relaxed. He drew on his pipe, which suggests not strychnine itself, but perhaps a related compound. A tropane alkaloid, perhaps. Atropine causes flushing, dilated pupils, delirium. Muscarine produces sweating and convulsion. But none of these precisely fit the presentation either. There are dozens of plant alkaloids, I said, some not well documented in the medical literature. Precisely. Holmes stared into the fire. Fenwick sent samples to the county toxicologist this afternoon. We shall have results in 3 or 4 days, but I do not intend to wait upon chemistry alone. What struck you most about the scene? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. 2 things, he said at last. The burned papers, some burned documents in that fireplace, deliberately, thoroughly. That requires prior knowledge of what the evening would produce, or rapid presence of mind in the immediate aftermath. Neither scenario is comfortable. And the second thing? The dessert dishes. He turned to look at me. 3 dessert dishes, all bearing residue of plum pudding. But Mrs. Tolliver told us she set the pudding on the sideboard. She did not serve it, which means the 3 individuals served themselves from the same vessel. The plum pudding itself was not on the sideboard when we examined the room. I stared at him. It was gone. The dish was gone, specifically. The roast chicken platter remained. The vegetable dishes remained. The dessert serving vessel was absent. He paused. Small thing, perhaps. But in this case, Watson, I have a profound suspicion that the pudding is the crux of everything. Thought about this for a long moment. Surely the housekeeper would have noticed. Would she? She arrived to find 3 dead people, arranged in attitudes of macabre contentment. In the shock of such a discovery, the absence of a serving dish is not the first thing one catalogues. He rose and knocked out his pipe. I must speak with Mrs. Tolliver again tomorrow, and I wish to examine the kitchen very carefully. We retired to the rooms Marrable had arranged for us at the hall. Holmes's was given over immediately to his chemicals and notebooks, mine to the careful records I was keeping of the case. As I wrote up the day's observations before sleep, I found myself returning again and again to Dorothea Wycliffe's description of the mysterious visitor. A man in his early 40s, dark complexion, limp in his right leg, well-dressed, visiting on matters that Sir Edmund had described only as a business matter. I wrote his description carefully and underlined it. Holmes had not commented on it at the time, and had not mentioned it this evening, but I had seen that fractional intensification in his eyes, and I had learned, in our years of partnership, that the things Holmes declined to discuss were frequently the things that mattered most. Chapter 5. The kitchen, the pudding, and the missing hour Holmes was up at dawn. I know this, because when I descended to the breakfast room at 7 o'clock, Mrs. Tolliver, who had remained at the hall, unwilling to abandon her post in the household's crisis, informed me that Mr. Holmes had been in the kitchen since 5:30, and had eaten a piece of toast and drunk 2 cups of tea, which she delivered to him at the kitchen table, where he was conducting what she described, with careful neutrality, as a thorough examination. I found him there still, crouched before the cold iron range with his magnifying glass, examining the interior of the oven with an attention that I suspected the oven's manufacturer had never anticipated. He was, I noticed, wearing rubber gloves, an unusual precaution for Holmes, who typically handled evidence with bare hands and clinical confidence. "Watson," he said without turning, "what do you know about castor beans?" I sat down. "Ricinus communis, the source of castor oil. Also the source of ricin, one of the most potent toxins known to medicine. A few milligrams can kill an adult. It works by inhibiting protein synthesis within cells, leading to systemic organ failure. Symptoms? Delayed onset, typically 12 to 36 hours after ingestion. Initial symptoms include nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. As the toxin works, multi-organ failure progresses. Death can occur from 3 to 5 days after ingestion in severe cases." I paused. "But ricin doesn't produce Rhizus sardonicus, Holmes, and it doesn't kill in hours." "No," he agreed. He stood, removed the rubber gloves, and placed something carefully into an evidence envelope, but I wasn't looking for ricin. He turned, and his expression was one I had seen perhaps a dozen times in our long collaboration. The contained excitement of a man who has found a piece of a puzzle and knows exactly where it fits. I was looking for what was cooked in this oven beside the pudding. He showed me what he had extracted from the oven interior. A fragment of something dark, adhered to the oven wall where the rack had pressed. A vegetable substance, charred but with a distinctive granular texture. Seeds, I said. Seeds, he confirmed. Specifically, I believe, the seeds of Veratrum album, white hellebore, an extremely potent plant alkaloid known as veratrine or gervine, depending on the specific compound extracted, produces intense burning and tingling in the extremities, convulsive twitching, cardiovascular depression, and, in sufficient dosage, death. Cardiovascular effects can be pronounced: bradycardia, hypertension, and in terminal cases, sudden cardiac standstill. My mind was racing. The facial expression, the facial musculature. Veratrum alkaloids can produce precisely the kind of involuntary muscular contraction that results in the appearance of a fixed, rictus-like smile. Not identical to strychnine's presentation, but easily confused by someone not specifically looking for it. He placed the envelope in his coat pocket. The standard toxicological screens sent by Fenwick's county office will likely miss it unless they specifically look. It is not commonly encountered in criminal cases. How was it administered? Holmes turned back to the range, then to the large pantry shelf beside it. The plum pudding vessel, a traditional ceramic basin, was missing, but Mrs. Tolliver's neatly organised shelves bore its ghost in the form of a clean circular mark in the otherwise dusty surface. Several other vessels stood nearby, unmodified. The pudding, Holmes said, was prepared 2 days in advance, as Mrs. Tolliver told us. It was set to steam in this oven. The plum pudding is an ideal vehicle for a compound of this kind, intensely flavoured with dried fruit, alcohol, spice. The alkaloid's characteristic burning taste would be entirely masked. The act of steaming further concentrates it within the pudding body. Then the pudding was poisoned during preparation? Or after? Pudding was left in the pantry for 2 days. Any person with access to the hall could have introduced the compound at any point during that period. He paused, and someone removed the serving vessel from the dining room, presumably to destroy the evidence of what remained in it. Who had access to the hall? That, Holmes said, is today's question. He spent the morning with Mrs. Tolliver, going through the household's routine of the previous 2 days with meticulous care. I sat in on the first part of this conversation and recorded it. The hall's routine was, apparently, orderly. Mrs. Tolliver lived in. A kitchen maid came daily from the village, a girl of 17 named Bessie Thorne, who had been given the day off on Tuesday, the day before the dinner, as the family was expected to dine privately. A gardener, Mr. Old Amos Price, worked the grounds daily, but did not enter the house. A laundry woman came fortnightly, and was not expected for another week. On Monday, Mrs. Tolliver had prepared the pudding in the evening and set it on the pantry shelf. She had then retired at 10. Sir Edmund had been in his study until midnight, she believed, as a light had been visible under the study door. On Tuesday, the kitchen maid's day off, Mrs. Tolliver had been absent from the hall between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, visiting a sick sister in the village. The hall had been, during that 3-hour window, in the sole occupancy of Sir Edmund, was at home and working, and any other member of the family or staff who might have been present. Was anyone else in the house during those 3 hours, to your knowledge? Holmes asked. Mrs. Tolliver hesitated, precisely the kind of hesitation that Holmes had long since identified as the precursor to a significant revelation. Mr. Reginald came, she said. He arrived at about 2:30, I believe. I passed him in the lane as I was walking to the village. He said he had come to speak with his father. Holmes said nothing for a moment. He let the silence sit, as he often did, using it as a kind of space into which the other person felt impelled to speak. He stayed about an hour, I think, Mrs. Tolliver added. He was gone when I returned at 5, and Mr. Reginald mentioned nothing of this visit when we spoke to him yesterday. I couldn't say what Mr. Reginald mentioned to you, sir. Holmes thanked her and rose. He turned to me, and his expression was controlled, but I knew the look. He told us he was in London, at his club. All day, he reached for his hat. Watson, believe we need to revisit Mr. Reginald Whitcliffe. Chapter 6. The Liar in the Library. Reginald Whitcliffe had taken up residence in his father's library, which struck me as both appropriate and faintly predatory. A man already occupying the seat of power, before the bodies were cold. He sat behind the great oak desk, with the air of a person rehearsing an authority they have not yet formally assumed, and, when Holmes and I entered and closed the door, he looked up with an expression I can only describe as braced. "You were at Wycliffe Hall on Tuesday afternoon," Holmes said, without preamble. "Between approximately 2:30 and 4 o'clock. Met with your father in his study. You told us yesterday that you were in London." Reginald Wycliffe's jaw tightened. The fair-haired, controlled man before us underwent a brief internal struggle that was written clearly enough across his features. "I forgot to mention it," he said at last. "You forgot?" Holmes said the words with perfect flatness, then sat down in the chair across from the desk and crossed his legs with the air of a man who has all the time in the world. "Mr. Wycliffe, I am not a policeman. I cannot compel you to tell the truth. But I suggest strongly that you consider the position you are creating for yourself. 3 members of your family are dead. You stand to inherit the principal estate, present in this house, alone with the pudding that I believe killed them, within the relevant window of opportunity. And you lied to us." He paused. Begin again. Another struggle. Then Reginald Whitcliffe leaned back and let something drop. The performance of ease, I thought. What remained underneath was more interesting. A man who was frightened. "I went to see father because of the legal opinion," he said. "I had heard from Bray's office. One of his clerks, indirectly, that the opinion had come back, and that it was favourable to the trust, as written. I wanted to be certain. And I wanted to know what father intended to do about Uncle Phineas, specifically. And what did your father tell you?" "He told me that he planned to inform Phineas at Wednesday's dinner that the challenge had failed, that there would be no further personal loans, and that Phineas should take steps to address his debts independently." He looked down at the desk. Father was tired. He had protected Phineas for years. He said he felt as if he was cutting something loose. And the visit lasted approximately 90 minutes, perhaps. We talked for a while. I left before 4. "Did you enter the kitchen or the pantry at any point during your visit?" Question landed like a stone in still water. "No," Reginald said, but the word came a fraction too quickly. Holmes studied him in silence for 10 seconds. Then, quite abruptly, he rose and said, "Thank you, Mr. Wycliffe. That will be all for now." In the hallway, I caught Holmes's arm. "He's lying about the kitchen. Almost certainly, but I am not yet sure whether he is lying because he is guilty, or because he is concealing something else that he is ashamed of." Holmes put on his hat. "In the meantime, I have a telegram to send." Chapter 7. The man with the limp Holmes's telegram went to his brother, Mycroft, and its contents Holmes declined to share with me, which was not unusual but was, in the present circumstance, particularly maddening. He also sent a separate communication to his network of informants in London. That remarkable web of individuals spanning every stratum of society, from street Arabs to retired civil servants. Collective knowledge of Holmes employed as a kind of distributed intelligence system. While we waited, I occupied myself with the coroner's Fuller report, which arrived by messenger from Guildford on Friday morning. Toxicological results were not yet complete, but the preliminary examination of the 3 bodies had produced an additional detail that I noted carefully. All 3 individuals showed evidence of dilated pupils. The finding was noted but unexplained by the county pathologist, attributed it tentatively to post-mortem change. I knew, from my medical training, dilated pupils were associated with several categories of pharmacological agent. Veratrum alkaloids, as Holmes had suggested, could cause them, but so could several other substances. The pupillary dilation, combined with the facial expression and the cardiac death, formed a pattern that nagged at me. On Friday afternoon, Mycroft's reply came, addressed to Holmes at the hall. I was not shown the full content, but Holmes's expression as he read it underwent a rapid series of changes. Recognition, confirmation, something that in another man I might have called grim satisfaction. "The man with the limp," he said. "Dorothea Wycliffe's mysterious visitor? His name is Mr. Adrian Caswell. He is a chemist, a genuine one, with university credentials, formerly employed by a pharmaceutical manufacturer in Heidelberg, and before that at a laboratory in Bombay. He has been based in London for the past 18 months, working as a private consultant." Holmes folded the telegram carefully. He was reported to Scotland Yard 14 months ago by a former associate, in connection with the preparation of an unregistered alkaloid compound. The report was investigated and closed without action due to insufficient evidence. "A chemist," I said, "with expertise in alkaloids, visited Sir Edmund Wycliffe twice in October. On matters that Sir Edmund described to his daughter only as business." Holmes rose from his chair. "Watson, I need you to go to the village and engage a trap. I am going to London. Now, this evening. There is a train at 6 from Guildford. I shall be back by tomorrow evening, I expect, with what we need to make this complete." He had already moved to gather his coat and hat. "In the meantime, I would be grateful if you would keep close observation on Mr. Reginald Wycliffe. He is not our primary concern, but I suspect he knows something that he has told no one, and anxiety may loosen him." "Holmes," I said, as he reached the door, "the burned papers." He paused and turned. "If the poison was in the pudding," I said carefully, "pudding was set 2 days before the dinner. Then, whoever poisoned it may or may not have known precisely when it would be served, but the papers were burned on the night of the dinner itself, after dinner. Which means either the killer was present at the dinner, or someone else, who knew what had happened, was in the house that night." Holmes looked at me for a moment with an expression that I can only describe, warmly analytical. "Watson," he said, "you have put your finger on precisely the right question. Keep it in mind while I am in London." And he was gone. Chapter 8. What Watson found by the fire left to my own devices at Wycliffe Hall, I did what Watson invariably does in such circumstances. I talked to people. I find, as Holmes sometimes acknowledges with reluctant credit, people speak more freely to a warm, unpretentious country doctor than they do to the electric intelligence that is Sherlock Holmes. Quality of his attention intimidates. Mine merely reassures. I began with Bessie Thorne, the kitchen maid, who had been brought back to the hall to assist with the household's disrupted routine. She was a bright, guileless girl of 17, with the forthright manner of someone raised to work and unimpressed by social performance. She sat with me in the kitchen, her natural territory, and answered my questions between polishing silver. Pudding was all right. "Tuesday morning," she said. "I saw it when I got in. Smelled it too, right through the cloth. Mrs. Tolliver had covered it proper, with muslin and string." "And when you left Tuesday midday?" "It was still on the shelf. I went past it on my way out." She paused in her polishing. "There was something else on Tuesday morning, though. I don't know if it matters." I encouraged her to continue. "There was a delivery," she said, "early before 8. A parcel left at the kitchen door. No one rang. I just found it there when I came down to start the range. A brown paper parcel, about so big. She indicated something roughly the size of a large book. Addressed to Sir Edmund, with no sender's name that I saw. My attention sharpened. What happened to it? I gave it to Mrs. Tolliver, who took it to Sir Edmund's study. She shrugged. Sir Edmund often had parcels delivered for his business. It seemed ordinary enough. It did not seem ordinary enough to me. Went immediately to Mrs. Tolliver, who confirmed the parcel's arrival, but noted that she had not examined it, and had no knowledge of its contents. Sir Edmund had received it without comment. I then went to Sir Edmund's study. The study was a book-lined room of comfortable disorder, the working study of an active mind, not a decorative one. The desk was cleared now, having been gone over by Marrable's men. The drawers had been inventoried, but the fireplace in the study was small, and the grate was cold, and contained only the ordinary ash of a coal fire. Turned my attention to the bookshelves. Holmes had taught me to look at bookshelves the way one reads a person's diary. The condition of the books, their arrangement, their subjects, the gaps between them. Sir Edmund's library was practical. Estate management, agricultural science, legal references, history, a section of natural history, including several botanical texts, and in the botanical section, placed somewhat recently from the disturbance in the dust, a slender volume that had been pulled out and returned carelessly, The Alkaloid Plants of Britain and Europe by Professor H.M. Schreiber, published 1889. I pulled it out, fell open to a page that had been bent in the corner as a marker. A habit I deplore in books, but in this case was profoundly grateful for. The chapter was titled Veratrum Species and Their Compounds, and there was a paragraph midway down the page that had been marked in pencil, lightly, but unmistakably, with a small bracket in the margin. The bracketed passage described the preparation of veratrine from the seeds of Veratrum album, and noted that the alkaloid was soluble in alcohol and fat, making it suitable for incorporation into rich food substances such as confections or puddings, where its characteristic burning taste would be substantially masked by complementary flavours. I sat with that book for a long moment in the quiet of the study. Then I put it carefully in my coat pocket and went to find Reginald Wycliffe. I found him in the garden, walking gravel paths in the November cold, with the purposeful aimlessness of a man who needs to think, and cannot think, indoors. When I fell into step beside him, he did not object, and for a little while we walked in silence. "Mr. Wycliffe," I said at last, "I think you need to tell me about the parcel." He stopped walking. He stared at the skeletal oaks, and then, very slowly, the structure of his composure came apart. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a wall whose mortar has long since failed, and waits only for the right weather. "I didn't know it would kill them," he said. His voice was very low. "I swear to God, Watson, I did not know." Chapter 9. Reginald's Confession and the Shape of the Truth. We sat in the garden's small stone folly, a silly Greco-Roman confection half hidden by overgrown rhododendrons, and Reginald Wycliffe told me what he knew. The November wind moved the bare branches above us. He kept his hands clasped between his knees and stared at the ground. 6 weeks earlier, he said, he had been approached at his club by a man who introduced himself as a business consultant. The man was in his early 40s, well dressed, with dark complexion and a slight limp in his right leg. "Caswell," I murmured. Reginald looked at me sharply. "You know him? Holmes does. Continue." Caswell had told him, with remarkable directness, that he was aware of the trust dispute and of Reginald's anxiety regarding his inheritance. He had indicated, obliquely at first, and then with increasing precision, that he could supply a substance that, administered in the plum pudding, that Mrs. Tolliver traditionally prepared ahead of the winter dinners, would produce. And these were the words Reginald used. with the stricken precision of someone repeating a thing they have replayed 1,000 times. Peaceful sleep from which your uncle will not wake. Your uncle, I said. Only your uncle. That is what he told me, Reginald said. He said it was precise. He said it could be measured to affect only one portion of the pudding, told to add a small amount of a compound. Delivered in that parcel to one specific section of the pudding while it was in the pantry, pressed his hands together until the knuckles whitened. He told me it was entirely painless. He said it was a compound used in the continent in certain medical situations. He presented it as euthanasia, almost. As mercy. And you believed him. A long silence. I wanted to believe him, Reginald said, with a misery that seemed entirely genuine. Uncle Phineas was destroying the family. The debt, the legal actions. Father was aging under the strain. I told myself. He stopped. You told yourself a great many things, I said gently, without heat. And on Tuesday afternoon, when you visited your father and said you entered no kitchen. I did go into the pantry, he said. For no more than 2 minutes, I followed Caswell's instructions exactly. A small vial into one section of the pudding stirred in, I thought. His voice broke briefly. I thought it was localized. I thought it would only affect one portion. Phineas always served himself first. He was greedy at table, thought. He could not finish. He did not need to. I could see the shape of what had happened. Compound. Whether through Reginald's inexperienced administration or through Caswell's deliberate deception, had been distributed throughout pudding. All three had served themselves from the same vessel. All three had died. Caswell intended this, I said, thinking it through, even as I said it. He gave you an insufficient quantity to affect only one portion, or an instruction he knew you would execute incorrectly, or, more likely, a compound that was never going to confine itself to a single serving. He used you, Mr. Wycliffe. The question is why he wanted all three of them dead, and not merely your uncle. Reginald looked up at me. Why would he want my father dead? That, I said, is exactly what Holmes has gone to London to discover. Chapter 10. Holmes returns with the final piece. Holmes arrived at Wycliffe Hall on Saturday evening, having been in London for 36 hours. He came directly from the Guildford station, having sent no telegram of his return, and arrived in a hired fly as dusk settled heavy and cold over the hall's grounds. I was waiting for him in the library, having spent the interim hours in careful thought and in writing up Reginald's confession, which I had transmitted to Inspector Marrable with Reginald's reluctant agreement. He looked tired, which was unusual for Holmes, but his eyes were alive, with the light of a man who has assembled the last piece of a picture, and found it exactly as he predicted. I had laid out the botanical book, my notes, and a decanter on the library table. He poured himself a modest glass, read my notes without comment, examined the marked passage in the book, and then sat down. "Good work, Watson," he said, which was, from Holmes, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "The same to you, presumably," I said. "What did you find?" "Everything." He set down his glass. "Adrian Caswell is a chemist of genuine talent who has spent the past 3 years constructing a scheme of remarkable audacity. He has not been working alone. He has a partner, a woman named Mrs. Vera Harland, formerly the private secretary and confidante of one Mr. Phineas Wycliffe." I sat forward. "Phineas's secretary?" "Former secretary. They formed a personal relationship some 2 years ago. Caswell and Phineas Wycliffe were known to one another through a gambling establishment in Bath. Both were regular visitors, were heavily in debt. Mrs. Harland provided the bridge between them." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Here is the design." Phineas, despairing of his legal options, sought an alternative means of securing his inheritance. He found Caswell, a man with the chemical knowledge and the criminal flexibility to provide it. The plan, as originally conceived, was simple: poison Sir Edmund. Phineas inherits the full estate as the surviving male Wycliffe of the senior generation. The trust resets in his favour. But then Reginald approached Caswell, I said slowly. Or Caswell approached Reginald. And a more complex design emerged. Caswell approached Reginald, Holmes confirmed. He identified him as a person susceptible to such an approach. Ambitious, anxious, not scrupulous under sufficient pressure. He sold Reginald a modified plan. Phineas dies. Reginald inherits cleanly. Caswell receives a substantial payment. What Caswell did not tell Reginald, and what Reginald did not know, was that the plan had been reversed, entirely. I stared at him. Reversed. Phineas Wycliffe was never intended to die. Compound Reginald administered was real and fatal. But it was not what Caswell told him it was. Caswell told Reginald it was targeted, limited, controllable. In fact, it was a uniform veratrum preparation that would affect any quantity of pudding consumed. Caswell knew it would kill everyone at the table. But then, Phineas Wycliffe was not meant to be at that dinner. He was supposed to have received a message from Caswell through Mrs. Harland, summoning him to Bath on an urgent pretext. The message would keep him away from the hall that night. Sir Edmund, Lady Constance, and the plum pudding would see to the rest. Sir Edmund dead, the trust would pass in its complex way, and Phineas, the surviving brother, would, in fact, gain a significantly improved position, even without inheriting the hall directly. The silence stretched. I turned it over in my mind. But Phineas came anyway, I said. He came anyway. The message was delayed. Mrs. Harland sent it through an unreliable courier, and it arrived in Bath after Phineas had already departed for Crestwood. He arrived at the hall in the afternoon, decided to stay for the dinner he had been told to avoid, never knowing he was attending his own death. Holmes's voice was flat and precise, but there was something beneath it that I recognised as the particular quality of anger Holmes reserved for crimes of exceptional, cold-blooded calculation. Caswell did not know Phineas was at the dinner until he read of 3 deaths in the Surrey correspondence column of Saturday morning's Times. The burned papers, I said suddenly. Yes, Caswell was here that night. Not at the dinner. He was in the village, watching. Quite. When he saw that 3 people had died, he understood immediately that his plan had gone catastrophically wrong, and that the evidence in that dining room, the serving vessel, possibly certain papers that Sir Edmund had been reviewing, needed to be removed. Holmes looked at me. He had a key to the hall. Phineas had given him 1 month ago for the purposes of the conspiracy. He entered after the household was asleep, Mrs. Tolliver in the east wing, removed the pudding vessel, and whatever documents he thought incriminating, burned the rest in the dining-room fireplace. He was in and out within an hour. How can we prove this? We have Reginald's testimony, which establishes Caswell's approach, his instructions, and the vial he provided. We have the botanical book with the marked passage, which matches the compound identified in my kitchen samples. My brother Mycroft, through his connections, has traced 2 cash withdrawals from Reginald Wycliffe's account over the past 6 weeks, consistent with payments to an intermediary. Holmes rose. And this morning, before I took the train back, I paid a visit to Mrs. Vera Harland's lodgings in Bermondsey. And she was not at home, but her landlady was unexpectedly forthcoming when I presented myself as a tradesman collecting on an outstanding debt, a fiction I found satisfying to maintain. Mrs. Harland, she told me, parted 2 days ago with 2 travelling bags and left no forwarding address. Holmes reached into his coat pocket and produced a small card. She left this, however, for someone she had apparently been expecting to call, someone who had not been by. The landlady had opened it, read it, found it incomprehensible, and thus had retained it. He laid it on the table. I leaned forward to read it. The card for 4 words, in a neat feminine hand. He knows. Leave tonight. Chapter 11. The Trappist Holmes dispatched Marrable immediately to the railway stations, Waterloo, Victoria, and London Bridge, with descriptions of both Caswell and Mrs. Harland. A coastal watch was also requested. He moved with the calm urgency of a man who is slightly behind events, but confident in his ability to close the gap. They will not flee together, he said, as Marrable's men departed. Caswell is intelligent enough to know that they are more visible as a pair. They will have agreed upon a meeting point. Continental, I suspect. Calais, or possibly Antwerp. Then we may lose them, possibly Caswell, Mrs. Harland is less experienced and will make a mistake. He turned to me. There is, however, one avenue that I believe I have not yet exhausted. Mrs. Harland sent that card to Caswell. Caswell had not been to collect it, which means either he was already gone, or he did not know of its existence, if the latter. He may still be in London, I said. My network has been watching his Bayswater address since yesterday afternoon, Holmes said. No movement. But Caswell is not a fool, he has other addresses. He used one, I believe, near the Cripplegate for his laboratory work. He would not abandon his equipment without retrieving certain items, particularly the remainder of his alkaloid preparations, which could be used as evidence against him and which he would be reluctant to leave in anyone's hands. He picked up his coat. I am going back to London tonight. I need you to remain here with Marrable and keep Reginald Wycliffe from doing anything precipitous. He is in a fragile state, and I do not want him to make any communication with Caswell, if he has means of doing so. Is that likely? Caswell told Reginald to contact him through a post office box in the city if anything went wrong. I have had that box watched since yesterday. Nothing has been collected. He paused at the door. But if Caswell learns that the investigation has developed this far, he may reach out to Reginald, to silence him or to use him, keep him close. He was gone into the night. I was left at Wycliffe Hall with a murderer's unwitting accomplice, a traumatized household, a particular kind of wakeful anxiety that Holmes always contrived to distribute liberally among those who assisted him. I did not sleep well. Reginald Wycliffe, I found at 11 o'clock, when I checked, was in his father's study with a glass of brandy staring at the empty fireplace. He did not speak when I entered, and I did not press him. I simply sat in the chair by the window and kept him company in silence, which is sometimes the only useful thing one can offer. At 1:30 in the morning, a telegram arrived from Holmes. It was addressed to me, and it read, "Found him. Cripplegate Laboratory. Come by first train. Bring Marrable, do not delay." Chapter 12. The Laboratory at Cripplegate. The first train from Guildford reached London Bridge at 7:30 on Sunday morning. First, Marrable, and I took a cab directly to Cripplegate, a district of the city that in the working week bustled with commerce, but on a Sunday morning had a peculiar deserted quality. Warehouses shuttered, lanes empty, the great brick buildings wearing the silence of institutions on a day off. Holmes met us at the corner of Wood Street, apparently fresh as spring despite an evidently sleepless night, eyes bright and his manner carrying that particular energized composure that meant he had succeeded. "He is still inside," Holmes said. "Third floor, rear rooms." He has been there since approximately midnight. I tracked him from a contact who saw him at his Bayswater address at 10. He collected certain items there and came directly here. A pause. "He does not know we are outside." "How do we proceed?" Marrable asked, carefully. "He is a chemist with access to compounds. I would prefer not to be deployed in an enclosed stairwell." Holmes turned to Marrable's constable, a large and unflappable individual named Greer. "You will cover the rear entrance. There is a service ladder to the alley. He may attempt it, Spectre, with me to the front. "Watson, I am coming," I said, before he could direct me elsewhere. Holmes looked at me, and seemed to decide this was not the moment for argument. "Very well, stay behind me on the stairs." The building's caretaker, roused from his Sunday torpor, provided keys and the information that the third-floor laboratory had been rented for 8 months by a Mr. A.C. Roberts, a transparent enough pseudonym, and that the occupant had been observed entering the night before. We went up in single file, Holmes leading, Marrable behind me. The stairway was dark and smelled of turpentine and old brick. Holmes moved without sound, long-limbed frame managing the stairs, with the practiced silence of a man who had done this sort of thing many times before. The laboratory door was solid oak, fitted with a commercial lock that Holmes addressed with 2 instruments from his pocket and opened in 45 seconds. He pressed it inward slowly. The room beyond was a genuine working laboratory. Bench after bench of glassware, burners, specimen jars, notebooks, the complex aromatic tangle of a chemist's active workspace. Gas lamps burned low. At the far bench, a man stood with his back to us, decanting something from one vessel to another with great care. Adrian Caswell heard us a half-second before Marrable spoke. He turned, a compact, dark-complexioned man, with an intelligent face that in other circumstances I might have liked, and a slight awkwardness in his right stance that confirmed the limp. And his eyes went through a rapid sequence: recognition, calculation, something adjacent to resignation. "Mr. Caswell," Holmes said, "or Mr. Roberts, as you have been known here, I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Inspector Marrable of Scotland Yard. You know, I think, what we are here about." Caswell set down the vessel he was holding with great care. He looked at Holmes for a long moment with the expression of a man evaluating an opponent and coming to a conclusion. "The Wycliffe matter," he said. His voice was educated, precise, with a faint trace of somewhere warmer than England. 3 deaths, Holmes said, one of which, Mr. Phineas Wycliffe, was not intended. An accident of timing, I believe, though the law will take a view of the others that makes the distinction less consequential than you might hope. Caswell said nothing for a moment. Then, how much does the Wycliffe boy know? Enough, Holmes said. Another pause. Caswell looked at the bench, then at us, then at the door, calculating the geometry of escape and finding it unfavourable. He turned to face us fully, and in that moment his bearing shifted into something almost formal. The posture, I thought, a man who has decided to be caught with dignity. "Then I suppose," he said, "that is the end of it." Chapter 13. Holmes explains himself. The arrest, the transit to Scotland Yard, and the initial charge proceedings occupied the remainder of Sunday. Caswell was held without bail. His counsel summoned for the following morning. Second telegraph to the continental ports was sent in the hope of intercepting Mrs. Harland. Holmes expressed quiet pessimism on this point. She had, he felt, too great a head start, and too little reason to linger in any predictable location. We returned to Baker Street that Sunday evening, and sat either side of the fire in the long familiar arrangement of our evenings together. Mrs. Hudson had left cold beef and bread on the sideboard, and Holmes ate without apparent awareness of doing so, his mind visibly still running over the case. "Explain it to me fully," I said, "from the beginning." He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When he spoke, it had the quality of a man returning to something from the beginning, as a musician returns to the first measure. "Design was elegant," he said. "That is what one must acknowledge. Caswell is not a fool. He identified an opportunity. A wealthy family with internal conflict, 2 branches of it, each willing, under sufficient pressure, to contemplate the other branch's death. And he constructed a scheme that used each side's intentions against the other. He played Phineas and Reginald simultaneously," I said, "with different stories, different approaches, different promises. To Phineas presented himself as a solution to the eldest brother problem, a means of ensuring that Sir Edmund died, and the trust would, through a complicated legal route, benefit Phineas. To Reginald, he presented himself as a solution to the uncle problem, a means of ensuring that Phineas died quietly and Reginald's inheritance was secure. But his actual intention was to kill Sir Edmund and Lady Constance, and to profit from both sides of the conspiracy simultaneously. Reginald paid him, Phineas paid him, and with Sir Edmund and Lady Constance dead, complex legal situation would arise that a clever man with information on all parties could manipulate further. Holmes opened his eyes. What he did not account for was Phineas's presence at the dinner. Mrs. Harland is competent but not methodical. She chose an unreliable courier to save expense, and the message arrived too late. Phineas came to the dinner he was meant to avoid, ate the pudding he was meant never to encounter, and died with the two people his death was intended to liberate. A pause. A grotesque symmetry. I considered this. And the burned papers. A mixture of materials Caswell retrieved that night. Some were legitimate documents relating to the trust dispute. Letters Phineas had left at the Hall on previous visits that made reference, obliquely, to alternative arrangements he was pursuing. Had they been found, they might have led investigators toward Phineas's connection to Caswell. Caswell needed those removed. Holmes drummed his fingers lightly on the arm of the chair. There were also, I believe, financial records, letters between Caswell and Phineas regarding payments. He was thorough. And the botanical book? The marked passage? Holmes smiled faintly. A miscalculation of a different kind. Caswell had visited the Hall twice in October, on the pretence of consulting with Sir Edmund about a botanical investment, if you can believe it, a scheme involving cultivated plant compounds for pharmaceutical use. During one of those visits, he spent time alone in the study. He marked that passage, I believe as a kind of record, private notation of his own design. A professional habit, perhaps. He forgot he had done it, or forgot the book was there. Parcel delivered Tuesday morning. Contained a supplement to the main compound, an additional preparation Caswell sent to ensure the concentration was sufficient. He trusted Reginald to administer it correctly, which was itself a calculated risk, but he had prepared for Reginald's incompetence by ensuring the base compound was already lethal at the quantities he had provided at the first meeting. I sat with all of this for a long moment. The fire crackled. The fog moved against the window glass. "Holmes," I said. "Psst. You knew most of this before you went to London. You knew about the pudding and the kitchen. You suspected the compound. What were you missing?" "The motive for killing Lady Constance," he said quietly. "She had no role in the trust dispute. She was not the legal obstacle to anyone's plans. Death was collateral, if we are being cold about it. But Caswell is not a man who leaves loose ends. Lady Constance, I discovered in London through Mycroft's records, had become aware, in the weeks before her death, that Phineas was in some kind of irregular financial arrangement. She had written to her solicitor, asking whether it was possible to exclude Phineas from the trust entirely, on grounds of what she called conduct contrary to the family's interests. Her letter was, I believe, intercepted by Caswell through Mrs. Harland, who had retained connections in Phineas's correspondence. Caswell determined that Lady Constance was a threat, not immediate, but potential, and so she was included in his design. He killed her to prevent a future letter to a solicitor, I said. He killed her, Holmes said simply, because he could. Chapter 14. The Villain's Logic, and What It Cost. In the days that followed, the case of Wycliffe Hall occupied the newspapers with the enthusiasm that always attends crimes that combine domestic tragedy, social privilege, to the theatrical flourish of an unusual death. Holmes declined to speak to the press, as was his invariable practice. Marrable was quoted extensively, and gave us, I noticed, rather less credit than the evidence warranted, which I found irritating, and Holmes found entirely predictable. Reginald Wycliffe was charged with conspiracy to administer a noxious substance, and accessory to manslaughter. His counsel, a formidable chanceryman hired at considerable expense, was expected to argue mitigation on grounds that Reginald had not understood the lethal nature of the compound and had been materially deceived as to its effects. This argument was not entirely without merit. Holmes, when I raised the question of whether Reginald deserved sympathy, was characteristically direct. "He deserves the law," he said, "which is not quite the same thing as justice, and not at all the same thing as sympathy. He conspired to kill his uncle. The fact that he was simultaneously being deceived by the man who sold him the conspiracy does not absolve him of the original intention." He paused. "It may, however, reduce his sentence. The courts have a long history of treating the class and the confused with more leniency than they deserve. Dorothea Wycliffe, who inherited a portion of the estate outright as a named beneficiary of her father's individual will, separate from the trust, came to Baker Street a week after the arrest to thank Holmes. She was composed and clear-eyed, and did not perform grief for our benefit. She told us that she intended to sell her share of the property, and use the proceeds to establish herself more permanently in Guildford as an artist. She thanked Holmes with directness and sincerity, and departed without unnecessary ceremony. "A remarkable young woman," I said after she had gone. "Observant," Holmes said. "She described Caswell with sufficient precision that I knew within 30 seconds of hearing her account that we were dealing with someone Mycroft's office would have a record of. She noticed his limp, his colouring, his approximate age, his clothes. If she ever tires of painting, Scotland Yard could use her." He said this entirely without irony. Mrs. Harland was apprehended 18 days later, in Ostend, having been traced by the Belgian police through a bank draft she had attempted to cash. She was extradited, tried alongside Caswell the following spring, and convicted as a principal co-conspirator. Caswell, in his own defence, articulate and unrepentant, arguing with a chemist's precision that the compound he had designed was technically superior to anything previously employed in criminal enterprise, and that his intentions had been realised in their essentials, even if the collateral consequences were regrettable. The jury was unimpressed. Caswell was sentenced to hang. Mrs. Harland received a life sentence. Reginald Wycliffe, as Holmes predicted, received 7 years. Chapter 15. The Nature of the Smiling Dead. There is a postscript to the Wycliffe case that I have hesitated to include, being uncertain whether it serves any narrative purpose beyond the morbid. But Holmes, when I showed him the draft of this account, insisted that I include it, on the grounds that intellectual honesty requires not only the presentation of elegant solutions, but also of the questions that elegant solutions leave unanswered. The question that remained unanswered was the expression. The risus sardonicus, the fixed, almost joyful expression on the faces of all 3 victims, had been attributed by the toxicologist in his final report to the specific muscular action of the veratrum alkaloid at high doses, combined with the particular circumstances of cardiac death, rapid cessation of consciousness, followed by a freezing of the facial musculature in its last voluntary state, final voluntary state. The question of what Sir Edmund, Lady Constance, Phineas Wycliffe had been doing in the seconds before the compound reached its lethal threshold. This could not be answered by chemistry. Mrs. Tolliver, in a conversation some weeks after the trial, told me that she had thought about those faces every night since finding them. They looked happy, she said. Not frightened, not surprised. happy, as if something had just been said that pleased them very much. I turned this over in my mind and eventually put it to Holmes. On a winter evening, not dissimilar to the one on which the case had begun. "What do you think they were doing?" I asked him. In the final moments, Holmes was at the window, watching the Baker Street fog press against the glass. He was quiet for a time. "Families," he said at last, "when they sit together in the small hours of private dinners, when the formal business is done and the wine is low in the glasses and the fire has reduced itself to embers, they sometimes speak in ways they do not speak at other times. They remember. They laugh at the same things they have always laughed at. They are, for a little while, simply themselves and one another." He turned from the window. "I think that whatever the compound was doing to their bodies, their minds were still present long enough to share some moment of that kind. A reminiscence, perhaps. A joke, something that made three people, in the middle of their dying, smile." He said nothing more for a while then. "It is the most terrible part of the case, Watson. Not that they were killed, not even the manner of it, but that the last moment, the moment they apparently experienced most fully, was one of genuine happiness, manufactured by someone else's plan." He turned back to the window. "Caswell did not intend them to be happy. He intended them to die, and yet against all his design they were. I wrote that down. I have thought about it many times since. Chapter 16. The End of the Matter. And the beginning of the next, Holmes took 3 new cases in December of 1895, all of which I am preparing to narrate in due course. And the matter of Wycliffe Hall settled into the category of resolved affairs that he filed, with his usual system, by index letter and date in the black tin box beneath his desk. Before it was so filed, however, he did one more thing in connection with the case. He wrote a paper, 7 pages, close written, on the chemistry of veratrum alkaloids and their potential for detection by toxicological analysis. He sent it, without a covering letter, to the Home Office pathologist. I know this because he mentioned it once, in passing, and declined to discuss it further. Paper proposed a specific supplementary test that, if adopted as part of routine examination, prevent a Caswell compound from being misidentified as natural cardiac death in future cases. Whether it was adopted, I cannot say. Holmes did not follow up. He rarely followed up. Having solved the problem, he moved to the next one. "Do you never think," I asked him one evening, proud, "about what might have happened if Mrs. Tolliver had not noticed the expressions? If the deaths had been recorded as natural cardiac events and the case had been closed?" Holmes looked up from a monograph he was reading on tidal patterns in the Thames estuary. "Yes," he said, and I think about the number of cases that were closed correctly, and the number that were closed prematurely, and the relationship between those numbers, and it produces in me an irritation that I find largely counterproductive." He returned to his monograph, which is why I sent the paper to the Home Office. "Always the next case," I said. He looked up again, and for a moment there was something almost gentle in his expression. The quality that appeared occasionally, without warning, behind the machine-bright efficiency that he so carefully maintained. "Always the next case, Watson," he agreed. "The ones behind us are resolved. Ones ahead of us are not." He glanced toward the window and the fog and the city beyond it. "And London, as you know, is very generous with its unresolved things." He turned the page of his monograph. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was climbing the stairs with the late post. The fire was good, the fog was doing what London fog does, and it was, by any measure, an evening no different from 1,000 others at Baker Street, except, as every such evening was, entirely different from any that had come before. Picked up my pen and began a fresh page of notes.